It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. The era of the 50s exploitation monster films. This was the era of kids getting cars, taking their best gals to the drive-in, and not exactly caring what was really on screen, as long as it reflected people that looked and talked at least somewhat like them and could potentially scare their gals into jumping into their laps during the movie. And hell, if the best gal would rather make out instead of watching the scary movies, I suppose that wouldn't be too bad either. But this era was full of filmmakers like your Roger Cormans or your Bird Eye Gordons or your William Castles. This was the era of American International Pictures and their executive producers James H. Nicholson and Samuel Z. Arkoff. These guys were mentioned a few weeks back when I covered Corman's The Pit and the Pendulum. Nicholson was a sales manager at Real Art Pictures, Inc., Real Art mostly distributed older Universal films. They would package old monster movies for theaters or other comedies and various other movies from Universal's B-movie arm. These were discontinued in 1946 when the studio became Universal International. It was why the original monster cycle came to an end as well. But Real Art would enter into a 10-year deal with Universal to release their movies, and often theater managers found these older movies actually did a little bit better than newer movies, and this transitioned into Real Art wanting to make new films, but shorter, cheaper movies to package as double features. Arkoff was an entertainment lawyer by trade. When he came to Hollywood, he then became a producer, and when he and Nicholson formed AIP in 1954, they specialized in small budget films with production schedules of only a few days. Cheap and fast, that was AIP's model and what the likes of Roger Corman would thrive in. Now, nearly all of AIP films turned profit. Arkoff is mostly noted as being the creator of a few subgenres like beach party, outlaw biker films, and exploitation films like Blackula, The Thing with Two Heads, and this film, I Was a Teenage Werewolf. Arkoff claims that he was the first ever to really exploit the idea of a teenager turning into a monster. He credits this idea for making the film profitable and then leading into other films that would have some variation of I was a teenage something or another in the titles. The pseudo-sequel to this movie was I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, and AIP nearly titled the movie Attack of the Puppet People as I Was a Teenage Doll. But this was a little bit of a short-lived phenomenon. What was not a short-lived phenomenon was the star of this movie's and the career that he would go on to have, Michael Landon. Right after appearing in this movie, he took the role of Little Joe Cartwright in Bonanza for 430 episodes between 1959 and 1973. In 1974, Landon scored another mainstream hit with 187 episodes from 1974 to 1983 as Charles Ingalls in Little House on the Prairie. He immediately followed that up again playing the angel Jonathan Smith in Highway to Heaven for another 111 episodes between 1984 and 1989. Landon died relatively young in 1991 from terminal pancreatic cancer. His passing was a surprise and was something felt deeply by fans of his for his 30 years of being a star on TV and from those he worked with. There are a few relationships issues he had with some of those professional acting relationships he had, but generally, he's mostly remembered for having a bit of a crazy sense of humor and being very protective of his younger co-stars in an almost paternal sense. He also was known for going toe-to-toe with television execs and being fairly fearless in fighting for himself, his co-stars, and the shows that he appeared on. But can the fearless one instill fear in us as a teenage werewolf? Well, I guess we'll have to find out. But a couple of things that can't be denied is that this movie is often labeled as being an origin point for a lot of camp humor and camp horror. Additionally, this movie's budget was reported somewhere around $100,000. Some sources say around $80,000, while others say closer to $125,000, but I'll split the difference here and just say an even $100,000. Either way, this movie made $2 million, so it's hard to argue this wasn't a hit in the late 50s and in the early 60s as it made the rounds. All right, so our tale starts at Rockdale High School, where a couple of kids are engaged in some afternoon fisticuffs. One of the combatants is Tony Rivers, and he's something of a punk at this school, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, he does get angry easily. He gets into these fights on the reg. He's not without friends or people who try to get him to not do this sort of thing, but he almost kind of can't help it. He's just a teenager with a lot of raging hormones and what us 90 guys would have called angsty. But anyway, after a local cop named Detective Donovan, who knows Tony and understands how he has this kind of short fuse, he breaks up this fight and he wants Tony to think about the future. He's trying to keep Tony from ending up with a criminal record and wants him to get some help from Dr. Brandon, a psychologist who helps the cops free of charge to talk to these angsty youths. Now, Tony is mildly receptive to this until Donovan mentions that this Dr. Brandon uses a particular form of hypnotherapy. Now, Tony even snaps at his gal Arlene and his dad, both of whom want him to do better and feel better. And Arlene would like Tony to see Dr. Brandon, but he's still pretty adamant against it. They go to a Halloween shindig where the pranks start to get a little heavy. And it's all fun and games when he's pulling the pranks, but when he gets pranked, he decks the buddy who did it. And when Arlene tries to stop him, he inadvertently pushes her to the ground. And this gets him ultimately to agree to see Dr. Brandon. However, Dr. Brandon has an experiment of his own that he's finally found the right subject for, Tony. So Brandon's assistant is very concerned about all of this. Brandon wants to regress Tony, basically kind of take him back through various points of his childhood to cure him of that trauma, but also wants to see how far back he could potentially regress Tony if he could maybe bring out a more primitive version of himself or of humanity out of that. And basically he wants to use this as a way to break him down and build him back up. That's what he says. But really, the hypnosis therapy is to basically put him in the suggestible state so that Dr. Brandon could turn this kid basically into what he thinks will just be kind of more like a savage, kind of feral human. It's kind of a confusing thing, but that's basically what you hear. But Dr. Brandon rifles through Tony's memories of various past events, some of which were traumatic, and then he begins to give Tony other imagery of being a wild animal that chases prey through the woods and ultimately catching it, biting into its neck, tasting its blood, and ultimately killing that prey. But one night after taking Arlene home, a guy is walking basically after a party that everybody was at, and Tony brings Arlene home and kind of decides to go home. He's seemingly a little perturbed, but then we see a guy walking alone through a small patch of woods, and he gets chased and later killed by some sort of a creature. The cops are kind of confused. The guy had no enemies. There has been no gang violence. The oddest thing was that it wasn't hands or a shiv that killed the guy. Fangs seemed the only likely cause of death. Now, the janitor at the police station, named Pepe, sees the picture of the victim and knows that this is a werewolf. Pepe, you see, is from the Carpathian Mountains, where legends of werewolves began in Eastern Europe. Now, the cops aren't so sure about this, but Pepe has no doubt in his mind. But meanwhile, Tony tries to talk to Dr. Brandon about what happened that's been reported about this guy's death. Now, even Dr. Brandon's assistant is not so sure that he should, take the story of a mauled kid in the woods all that nonchalantly. However, Tony's principal is extremely pleased with Tony's conduct at school, so she would like for him to continue his sessions with Dr. Brandon. And that kind of ties into one of my likes that I'll talk about a little bit more later, about how this movie kind of treats this character of Tony. But as he leaves the meeting with the principal, Tony stops to watch the pretty gymnast practicing alone in the gym. And he's seemingly under control. Everything's fine. He's just watching her do her routine. But then the class bell goes off right in his ears, and that triggers a transformation, and he attacks and kills the gymnast. However, he is spotted by not only the principal, but several of the students at the school. Everyone sees he was some sort of a creature, like a werewolf. And he looks straight up like the Wolfman. But the principal and other students recognized one thing: the clothing. The clothing that Tony wore to school that day. So now the cops are involved and believe Tony to be a killer. Now, they're not too keen on calling him a monster or a werewolf, but they do know that they need to find Tony because he's been identified by multiple people now. Now, the press is also quite well aware of all that's going on with Tony, and they are calling him for what he is, a werewolf. Plus, they know he's had a temper. They also know there's a psychologist involved here. So when the cops do ultimately talk to Dr. Brandon, he kind of refuses to say anything about the possibility of a beast running wild and killing people. He also noticeably steers clear of the word werewolf, but also knows a whole bunch about the topic. Later, the police and locals form a posse to search the woods for Tony, and Tony is ultimately attacked by one of the members of the posse's dogs, and he ultimately has to kill it. But the next morning, Tony is reverted back to his normal human looks. He first tries calling Arlene, but when she answers, he seemingly just kind of hangs up, unable to really speak to her. But he goes to Dr. Brandon, who already knows Tony has no choice but to go to him for help. But Brandon, though, wants to actually see his transformation and capture it on film. And when the doctor's phone rings, Tony transforms. He kills Dr. Wagner, that was Dr. Brandon's assistant, and then kills Dr. Brandon while the doctor basically begs for his life, saying, "Hey, I'm your friend. You know me. You don't want to do this." He wants to do it. He's a werewolf. And it was the doctor's doing. But just then, a uniformed cop and Detective Donovan bust into the office, and when Tony slowly creeps towards them, they shoot him multiple times, ultimately killing him. Tony reverts back to his normal looks, and Donovan and the other cop are both haunted by what they saw before they shot and killed Tony. But let's talk about 3 things that I like about I Was a Teenage Werewolf. First, okay, this may feel sort of like a backhanded comment in some ways, but I really do love the title of this movie. It's obviously meant to appeal to audiences of a certain age, and maybe to a certain intellectual angle as well. But it sounds like an exploitation movie, and to be fair, it really was. It's a title that almost feels like it's meant to be a joke. I mean, like, how many movies would you expect a throwaway line to be, "Oh, I'm watching I Was a Teenage," and then insert whatever makes that sound as ridiculous as it was meant to be. But that's the thing with Nicholson and Arkoff at AIP. They knew how to title something in a way that got the exact right audience to pull up into the drive-in or buy tickets at the local theater. Honestly, I guess it really didn't matter what the title was or if the quality was above or at the same level as the title, because this was background noise basically for all those boys and girls who were getting a little too busy with each other anyway. But next, I actually do appreciate the approach of this troubled teen flick. Many movies of this era, many of the exploitation, like the kid gone wild sort of stuff, would have had these, maladjusted kids flat out unreasonably despicable at best and flat out evil at worst. But they would basically be little Joe Pesci's from Goodfellas, if you know what I mean. They would be nearly irredeemable. They would have these crazy tempers, and they would have these crazy ideas of how they terrorize adults and all of that. I mean, at least here you have a kid who is unbalanced. He has a temper, but it's not like he didn't want to be a good kid. He tries to be a good boyfriend. He tries to be a pal. Or even someone who would like to be a good son and also respected by Arlene's parents. But the thing is that the moment he's kind of nudged to answer questions or defend something he said or did, even if it's not a bad thing, he starts to get squirrely and his temper starts to come out. And that's far more realistic as this kid who is part of a seemingly broken family whose dad has to work to support him, and also not having a mom around. So, he's a guy who is just simply troubled. I don't think he really ever wanted to kill anyone, at least under his own willpower. Now, what Dr. Brandon did kind of changes that, but whatever. I mean, he's just a kid with some bad childhood issues that manifest as a need to fight and to lash out. I mean, he's kind of a victim of circumstance and a victim of this mad scientist who's been looking for a specific kid to try his experiments on. And that's really messed up. And the movie kind of leans into that, but in an understated way. And another thing that I do think is also intentional is how much others would very much like Tony to change. They're more interested in how society would see him and not necessarily how he would feel. In the scene with the principal, she talks about how much she hoped to have someone, quote unquote, get inside of Tony to basically make him a credit to his father and society. They don't do too much with that, but damn it if that doesn't sound like it was meant to be something commenting on how much we expect kids of a certain age to ultimately reflect positively on everyone other than seemingly themselves. And third, surprisingly, this movie turns into something of a police procedural in the last 25 or so minutes. We have the police going around asking questions, trying to find out about Tony. And throughout this portion of the movie, his father and Arlene are both vouching for his character. Yeah, he's had troubles, but he wasn't inherently a bad kid. And even Detective Donovan also knows he's likely not a killer when he's, thinking with his own head. Plus, I mean, damn, that Dr. Brandon seems to be a little tricky around the word and of, the word werewolves and the whole lore of where werewolves started as a myth. And again, there is this sense of Tony not necessarily being someone who must be put down like a dog. I mean, they want to catch him, but they don't really want to kill him. They want to keep the town safe too. So yeah, I mean, there is this sense again that they don't want the teenage werewolf to be seen as a bad teenage kid who also happens to be a werewolf and therefore must be destroyed. Now, yes, they do ultimately kill Tony, but it is much more of a self-defense type of kill. And again, like I was saying with the second it's not like the cops are hell-bent on finding that damn Tony, who's very much this awful kid who must be dealt with. They are more concerned with the safety of the town. So you're not led to hate Tony because the cops are simply doing their job. So yeah, sure, Tony's part is handled well, and this police procedural final act has its own interesting angle too, because at the end of the day, the cops are actually doing the right thing. They're trying to protect the town. They're also just trying to find Tony and try to resolve everything. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. And you can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Wednesday morning Film Seizure podcast show and the Monday afternoon Monster Monday show at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. And you can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, we go a little more modern as we visit the 2000s. And to kick things off, we head for a far-off, barren rock of a planet and seek help from an enigmatic criminal in pitch black. And until next week, stay spooky.